new business I want to discuss and address, but I want to start out by commending the superintendent and his staff. Very specifically, if I may, Dr. John Pace, who facilitated point on these issues as the Chief Operating Officer, Dr. Sylvia Diaz, Dr. Don Baglios, Dr. Ty Diggs, I always say Ty Diggs, Dr. Diggs, and Mr. Bueno, who facilitated the initial coordination of this conversation as Chief of Staff. I had an initial item that was framed for instructional leadership. It was actually proffered as a holder, and if you look at the history of my proffering of an item, I rarely, if ever, withdraw an item. We run the tables, and the item was drafted, it was prepared, and I was very, very concerned, but I was also excited about the opportunity to have the conversation about what we can do to address some areas of instructional leadership at the school site. It's not lost to any of us the adverse impact that the pandemic has had on student learning. We've had a year-long national narrative around the issue of academic regression. But right now, we're in the saddle. We are in the saddle. Our students are back in school. We are no longer under any considerate executive orders that will abdicate or be as forgiving of our students' lack of performance. Up until this point, we don't know what will happen moving forward. But last year, we understood that there were going to be some tremendous challenges operationally. The data and the practice clearly reflect that if students are not in school in in-person learning, that's going to have an academic adverse impact on their progress. The superintendent had provided some previous information relative to the FSA data for 2021. Those of you who know, I took a deeper dive in terms of looking at the schools in District 1. Very specifically, I requested those students that all of us have them that were forecast to be a D or F. If you're not aware, there were schools, although we didn't get a letter grade, based on the data, there were schools in our district that were forecast to be a D or an F. I got the data for my district, did a very thorough and deep analysis, visited some schools, had some conversations, looked at the response that came from Dr. Diggs and Dr. Diaz relative to the ETO and supported schools, squared and reconciled that, juxtaposed that with new principles, a number of elements that I came up with. We had a conversation at a meeting previously with staff. The superintendent and I had a discussion here at the board meeting relative to instructional leadership, of which, yes, we have principals who are very proficient in articulation, but I was taking a deeper dive and looking at principals who are proficient in demonstration and engagement. Not what it is that they say, but what it is that they do and what we're able to see in evidence in our schools. I squared all of that information, and that yielded a 5-page board item that you all have never seen, with about 8 recommends. Following that, Dr. Pace reached out, wanted to have a follow-up conversation relative to some of the issues in the item. And that conversation led to a real meaningful, very enjoyable, very refreshing, intellectual collaborative with all of those individuals that I mentioned over a period of at least 2 or 3 meetings. We talked about data, obviously. We talked about the forecast of prospective DNF schools. We talked about principal induction. We talked about mentoring. We talked about PD. We talked about training. We talked about resources. We talked about support that was coming through a framework via ETO or a framework that was outside of the scope of ETO. That conversation obviously led to some acceptable plan of action that I felt was very reasonable, very appropriate, very deliberate, very thoughtful over the course of the time frame in which I had to make a decision to release the item fully. I think our last meeting was the day before the items were due, and I was very, very excited, Mr. Superintendent, to walk out of that meeting with your team, very inspired and very confident, not in what was said, but quite frankly in the individuals who represented what would be done moving forward. This work and this conversation is really about an expedition in honesty, an expedition in transparency. I debunk, I reject, I lament any efforts to obfuscate issues that are staring us in the face. And I think that level of transparency, that level of candor, that level of honesty, that level of credibility from Dr. Pace, Mr. Bueno, Dr. Baglos, Dr. Diaz, Dr. Diggs. I think Ms. Alves was even participating in the meeting. And we all came to a great degree of consensus about gaps that we have currently on the heels of a worldwide pandemic. But in addition to the gaps, opportunities for improvement to mitigate, abate, and close those gaps for the betterment of our leaders, instructional leaders, the betterment of our teachers, the betterment of our schools, the betterment of our classrooms, but at the end of the day, for the betterment of our students. And I want to thank them for that. I did say parenthetically, as we often say as board members, you know, the item is still there. We could always dust it off and change the date. So what gets monitored gets done. But I've seen, Mr. Superintendent, a great degree, at least in my district, of rapidity around some of the issues that were conspicuously in need of being addressed. And we understand where we are right now, but that does not abdicate our role, our responsibility, and our right to ensure that our students get the best opportunity that they can. So through the chair, if I just may,
Sure.
Dr. Pace, if you could just maybe give a few highlights of some of the things that will be done moving forward from Florida City to County Line Road. Obviously, I started at ground zero in my district, but they did concede to the fact that these were some opportunities that could be looked at district-wide. And if they may, just take a few moments just to update the board and on the record for me, so that I can go back and play the tape and make sure that we are true to what we've committed to do to move our district forward through our schools and our principals. Thank you, Dr. Pace, through the chair.
Through the chair, I appreciate this opportunity, Dr. Gallen, and from our discussions which ensued over the past few weeks, and some discussions that actually began before we started having discussions with your office, we had an opportunity to truly collaborate across 3 departments: school operations, human capital, human resources, and the academics office, OAT as well as ETO, and to see what positive impacts can we make moving forward on our instructional leaders. And there were several key points that we took to task. First, looking at the difference or the balance between the support ETO schools receive as opposed to our schools outside of ETO, non-ETO, which are supported by our OAT office. And looking at where we are now, if we look at the projected grades, which we've had many discussions on how do we best support those principals to move those schools from where they are coming out of this pandemic, through this pandemic, propelling forward to where they need to be at the end of this school year. So 4 major points came from this, and I appreciate you. I want to give you credit for kind of giving us a North Star to collaborate on, and through your infinite vision of how you saw it, and we came together and put the action steps in place. And I want to highlight 4 specific points of how we're going to adjust support for instructional leaders at non-ETO projected F&D schools, especially with new leadership, new leadership or in a new position. They may have been a principal before, but now they're in a new school location, and we want to make sure they have the supports needed. So we looked at 4 areas. The support of the principal as far as the instructional leadership, specifically the curriculum and school culture. We also looked at the professional development, which comes on a monthly, annual, as well as a leader-to-leader optional basis, and how we can enhance those supports and ensure it's aligned to meet the needs of the instructional leader. Mentorship, the mentorship component, which is led by our human capital, but however implemented by our school operations and regions. And lastly, the resources to ensure that these instructional leaders have what they need to lead their school to success. So let me just start with the support mechanisms. We have 2 levels of support. We have our ETO support, and we've seen the success of our ETO schools and the type of support they receive. But now we also have our OAT support, which has had similar success, not maybe as loud as ETO, but to sustain the level of academic achievement, that's through the support of OAT. However, being in a position that we're in this year, we had to see how we could bolster that support and extend it. And we see opportunities, and not only see it, we have already taken action to make these opportunities available for our instructional leaders, specifically in these schools that have been identified. The number we actually identified were non-ETO principals in a projected, if school grades were to come out, the school grades from last year did come out at F&D, I think we identified between 12 and 16, which includes new principal or new assignment. So with these schools, as well as any other schools that might be fragile, even if they're not an F or D, but a C fragile school, we looked into conducting first instructional reviews, impact reviews, in collaboration, not just OAT, but with ETO and OAT together, to see where is that school right now to provide that principal the guidance they need to take their school to the next level. We also looked at a second point of ETO principals participate in instructional leadership workshops monthly. We have identified for these principals to now participate in those ETO leadership workshops as well as the OAT workshops, which will give them another keen eye, clinical eye development in instructional leadership of what great classroom instruction looks like, what good professional development looks like, and what good feedback to impact the instruction in the classroom looks like. So these principles have been identified and will now take part in that development. Next, we looked at our professional development ongoing. First, we have our scale professional development, which we made adjustments to. However, now we have our leader-to-leader, in which these principles will be aligned based on their needs to the leader-to-leader workshops based on the impact reviews. So adjustments will be made going forward so that the development they get is aligned to what the need of the school is to take that school to the next level and proper achievement. The third point, mentorship. Mentorship. Each of these principals have been assigned mentors, at least 2 mentors. These mentors are current successful principals at schools right now who have been assigned to all of the newly assigned principals. Outside of the mentors that are at schools, Human Capital actually has a 3rd mentor, which are principals who have retired but bring a historical knowledge to train all of these new principals. So collectively, they have 3 mentors. We've adjusted the mentorship plan from a 3-school site visit to actually a monthly visit, excluding testing month and the month of data collection in December, where the mentor and mentee will have an on-site visit with their mentor, focus on instructional rounds, instructional walkthroughs that improve academic achievement as well as the safe learning environment and school culture. So that is a change we all agreed that should be made and starts effective immediately. On top of the mentorship, the last point we looked at are the resources that these schools need to succeed. with these resources, as the superintendent spoke about before, the instructional coaches, but aside from instructional coaches being assigned to the school, the extended learning opportunities that are necessary and the funding for those extended learning opportunities, and the ability for these principals to ask for the resources and receive them in a timely fashion has been one of the major adjustments to how we have come together across 3 bureaus to ensure new principals have what they need to succeed. One of the things we spoke about is the ability for a new principal to be able to speak up, to be able to feel confident to say, this is what I need, and also our development in teaching them how to speak up. So that is a key point where we're working between school operations and the region offices who will monitor that the mentors are doing their visits with the new principals, as well as academics, ensuring that the resources and that the support mechanisms through curriculum support specialists, instructional supervisors are at the school sites on a timely basis, whether that is weekly or bi-weekly, to support the principal in what they need, and the bringing together the mentor on the ground, a principal who's doing the work, who's doing it well, who can advise this new principal, this mentee, and answer any questions that they may feel, you know what, I'm not too sure, I'm afraid to ask my supervisor this, but they have a point person, not just one, not just two, 3-point people that they can go to ensure their success. So we look forward to seeing the implementation and the feedback component. I apologize, I forgot to mention that. We're doing monthly surveys with these principals through quantitative as well as calls to ensure their mentorship, their development is what they need to succeed. So along with the instructional review that is happening this month, we will conduct another one to ensure and follow up after January that they are headed in that final direction before we get to where we need to get to. I apologize for taking so much time. Thank you, through the chair.
Madam Chair?
Sure.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Dr. Pace, and I think the time that you just took would obviously is much more abbreviated than it would have been had we had to address this through an item, and I'm very, very encouraged about the work that you, the team, and the superintendent, I'm sure, is very much engaged. He and I had a brief conversation about it. Very excited about where you're articulating and the look forwards that we can expect in all of our schools. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge one school that had been on the radar for years, even before I got on the board. I visited that school, hit all of the elements: administrative visibility, security protocols in place, clean school facility, bell-to-bell instruction, effective use of technology, evidence of student work learning, progress monitoring in place, student incentives in evidence, rigorous course offerings, and positive school culture. All of those things were witnessed, tangible and measurable indicators in the school during that visit. And that school was a school that received 5 consecutive Fs, has not been an F or a D since, has had tremendous turnaround leadership, starting with the first principal that took it from an F to a C, through Mr. Negron, who is now working in ETO, and now on the leadership of Mr. Harrison, and that is Carroll City Middle School. So instructional leadership, support, sense of urgency, all of them do work to improve the learning outcomes of our schools. Mr. Superintendent, you'll be pleased to know that the enrollment in that school is going up. The community pride around that school is off the roof. And again, I want to thank you and your leadership, but I also, first and foremost, want to thank the board because that was the first board item that I proffered when I got elected, is to address this issue of fragile schools. And that is not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's not something that we do in a very episodic way from other items that address this issue that many of us have proffered to this conversation that we're having right now. We must stay the course as it relates to instructional leadership and all of those elements that will move our schools forward. So thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know if the superintendent was attempting to say something about this, but I definitely wanted to utilize this as an opportunity to commend, congratulate, encourage, and forecast great things that will come out of this conversation and collaboration that we had over the past several weeks. Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know if this.
Thank you, Dr. Gallen and Dr. Pace. Mr. Superintendent?
Just very briefly, Madam Chair, thank you. I really appreciated the comments made by Dr. Pace, the comments made previously by Dr. Diaz, and these are recurring themes, themes that are indispensable to good leadership and good schools, and the elements are well known to us. I think we are proud of what principals are doing, and I can tell you just this morning, a number of cabinet members had direct interaction with all principals in our school system, and the point that I want to stress is that the issue of current fragility, academic fragility of schools, is not unique at this point in time to ETO schools. It is not unique to Tier 3 schools. Actually, when you look at, and we'll have more conversations with the board to expose you more to the current reality, not only in this district, but across the country, when you look at the performance shift from last year to this year, but even in terms of progress monitoring, October of last year to October of this year, we see significant terrain that must be gained very quickly in ELA reading, but more pronounced in mathematics, where the loss was even more significant, and there's a reason for that, obviously. Math skills scaffold, so if you miss out on one important step, you miss everything that comes after. And the story is a simple one, but it's a sobering one, is that there are a lot of principals in this district that are used to getting those A's for those schools, or B's consistently year after year. They've never been a Tier 3, 2, or even, one watch. However, when you look at what the grade for that school would have been, if a grade had been designated, they would have been there. So this is the equivalent of now careful, strategic actions on these schools. That's why, as Cabinet, we have the first ever district-wide datacom to ensure that every single member of senior staff has responsibility for what's happening in every school. So it's no longer datacom associated only with ETO, and that is why the narrative now with all principals reflects what I just described, is that this is a state of emergency, there is an academic crisis, and this time it is not only associated with schools that have high levels of poverty, high percentages of ELL students, or high percentages of students with disabilities. It is an across-the-board crisis. And the first indispensable cure is effective leadership, data-driven leadership that is coupled by strategic actions that advance student achievement. And immediately following that, obviously, is that same level of strategic thinking on the part of teachers. And that's why that data-driven analysis and strategy, yes, it is discussed at cabinet level, but goes all the way down to an individual classroom where the teacher and the students need to understand, own, and react to their own data. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair?
Yes, sure.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. And if I may, I know exactly what you're saying, and I appreciate the language that you used, state of emergency, state of academic emergency. And I want to say parenthetically, that is why I was so proud, Madam Chair, colleagues, when I got on the board in December. The first item that I proffered was about fragile schools. It was unanimously co-sponsored, and it was unanimously, obviously, supported, because it was recognized then that I had colleagues who did not view, when presented with the facts, that this was a District 1 issue, a District 2 issue, a District 9 issue. Hence, Florida City to County Line Road was coined. I kind of coined it then, because although we're elected in certain voting districts, we all have a shared degree of responsibility for the educational empowerment, elevation, and enhancement of our student population. So just through the chair, I want you, if I may, Mr. Superintendent, I heard you, but if you could just punctuate what you said, and I'll kind of tee it up. I heard the superintendent say, and what I have reviewed the data to reveal, is that schools across this district that have historically been A's and A's and A's and A's, 7, 10-year runs, that the issue of fragility may not have knocked on the door of certain communities and zip codes. The issue of academic fragility and performance declines have knocked on all doors. Would that be a fair statement? 10-year runs. Some schools and districts had 10-year runs of A's. We're going to drop to B's or C's. That was going to be a decline that I looked at in some of the data points, and I wanted you, Mr. Superintendent, if you could just punctuate that as succinctly as you can through the chair.
Absolutely. So through the chair, you are absolutely right. Both in ELA reading as well as mathematics, we have observed high single-digit to double-digit proficiency loss across the board. By the way, proportionally shared across all grade levels, so this is not a senior high school versus elementary versus middle. The loss is pretty consistent across all grade levels from kindergarten all the way to high school. And I'm speaking specifically about, as I said, iReady data or state accountability data. Yesterday's A rate under the last data that we received from the state probably would have resulted in a disproportionate number of schools now being C's. A lot of schools that performed at B level could fall to D. And after 3 years of no F and the first year without D, we would see a steep incline in F and D schools. And some of these schools were historically B and C schools. So there is a huge technical adjustment, a technical correction that we're seeing. By the way, our rate of loss is pretty parallel to the states. And it's pretty parallel to what's being discussed across the country, particularly when we look at iReady progress monitoring data. So Dr. Gallen, you're absolutely correct. This is an emergency, an academic emergency. It is an instructional crisis, and that's why all shoulders are on the wheel right now. I can guarantee to you that every single principal in this district today has an in-depth analysis, an understanding of not only where their school is, where their school was going back 1 year, where their school is today, but also where the entire school system currently is. There is a sense of urgency, and I think if there's a silver lining here, right, is that the strategic work that is more pronounced in fragile schools in the ETO environment is now one that needs to be embraced and deployed district-wide. It will take that to overcome and accelerate over the losses that we have experienced and seen.
Thank you, Dr. Gallen. Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. All right, any more new business from board members? Sure, go right ahead.
Just a question, not about this. This is another new business item. Got some information relative to the deployment of the provision of resources to support staff, i.e. counselors versus CAP advisors. Through the chair, do we provide them with, for example, do they get teacher lead? Do they get some additional opportunities for, there's a perception that the CAP advisors, who also commit additional time and energy and effort after school, before school, or what have you, don't receive some of the allocations that the counselors in general may receive. Not for a question to be answered, but this was something that was brought to my attention. In fact, there was a weekly briefing that went out, and I guess some of them felt a little dejected because it referenced, I'm telling you, they send information left and right. The weekly briefing number 31503 relative to hourly funding for school counselors and trust counselors. That was the issue. But the CAP advisors who may stay after school meeting with children for applications, college readiness, were not included. So this was that briefing, 31503. It only referenced school counselors, hourly funding for school counselors and trust counselors, but it didn't include the CAP advisors who do similar work in the schools. So,
Through the chair, I can address that.
you know, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that, and in fact, Dr. Gallen, in our most recent meeting with all principals in the district, principals had an opportunity to ask questions, and a couple of questions that were asked were specific to a desired greater flexibility over utilization of those dollars that we allocated to each school to satisfy additional counseling support need, more flexibility to be extended to other areas. So that flexibility has been agreed to and conveyed to the principals, and there should be no impediment whatsoever, even though the original language in the briefing was pretty restrictive, right? There is currently no impediment to extend those dollars to be utilized by other team members within the Student Services Department or suite.
Thank you. Follow up, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. So that information will be conveyed, and those cluster of CAP advisors that express interest, they'll be notified that they're available. Will there be some other communication that will clarify that?
So through the chair, actually, Dr. Pace is certainly more than empowered to provide that, but I can tell you that just this morning,
Okay.
out of my mouth to all principals, that information was provided. In fact, there was some additional information provided that with regional approval, there may be even additional flexibility on the use of those dollars for schools. And this is a critical reality. There are some schools who would love to hire the 6th counselor. The thing is that they don't have bodies. There are no bodies out there to be hired. So they said, look, we could use some of those dollars to provide additional tutorial services before and after school. So we liberalized the use of those funds with regional approval. But to the extent that the dollars are to be used with other student services staff, such as a CAP advisor or a trust counselor or a social worker, it is absolutely appropriate, and principals know that, but I think that Dr. Pace will be sending something out in addition.
Through the chair, thank you, Mr. Superintendent, and I'll follow what Dr. Pendros Mendengar's office is when she looks into the camera. I hope you're listening. So thank you, Mr. Superintendent. That I did get a couple of communications to the point that they actually sent me the weekly briefing that was very specific, so thank you.